A king who can't read, a kidnapped queen, a civil war that will last 3 generations, and a slave revolt that changes everything. This is the story of Rome. The year is 27 BC, and the most powerful man in the world is a guy who can't even read or write. His name is Octavian. He got his start when he was just a teenager, inheriting the title of Caesar from his recently assassinated father. But it was his great-uncle's will that really set him up for success. You see, Julius Caesar had no legitimate children, only a grandnephew named Octavian, who was adopted by Caesar and made his heir at age 16. Now, according to Roman law, the will of a dead person couldn't be opened until they were 6 feet under. So while Octavian was busy getting his power on, he waited until Caesar's body had been cremated, and then he snuck into the pile of ashes to grab his uncle's will. And inside it said, "Hey, Octavian, you're my heir, so here's half my stuff." With that, Octavian was set for life. But there was one small problem. Julius Caesar had a lot of enemies, and those enemies weren't just gonna let Octavian waltz into the forum and collect his inheritance. The first contender for Caesar's stuff was Mark Antony, who was not only Caesar's right-hand man, but also his brother-in-law. Then there was Caesar's widow, Cleopatra, who wanted her late husband's fortune because she needed it to pay back all the money she owed to Egypt as creditors. Then there was Agrippa, who was Julius Caesar's adopted son and heir before Octavian came along. And finally, there was Lepidus, another one of Caesar's relatives who was always trying to get his hands on more power. In short, there were a lot of people who wanted what was now Octavian's. So with the help of a few loyal generals, Octavian spent a few years making sure that everyone who could potentially challenge him for Caesar's inheritance was either dead, imprisoned, or exiled. Meanwhile, the Senate, which had hated Caesar for turning the Republic into an empire, loved Octavian because he promised to restore their power. And so it seemed like Octavian was destined for greatness. But it wasn't that easy. In 43 BC, the assassins of Julius Caesar were brought to trial, and 2 of them, Cassius and Brutus, went on the run. They rallied the Roman provinces of Greece and Asia Minor to their cause and raised an army of 20,000 men to take on Octavian. But at the Battle of Philippi in 42 BC, Octavian and his partner Mark Antony won a decisive victory and chased Cassius and Brutus into separate holes where they both killed themselves. But this was actually a pretty big mistake on their part, because it turned out the ghost of Julius Caesar was hanging around and waiting for his revenge. You see, after being kicked out of the afterlife by Octavian, Caesar's ghost began haunting him. And as punishment for killing his adoptive father, Caesar's ghost told Octavian he would have to fight a civil war against his own sister. It's a long story, but basically Octavia, who was married to the leader of Rome's opposition, got herself in a bit of a pickle. When Octavian marched on Rome with his army, she refused to let him in and instead sided with the senators. And so Octavian besieged Rome for 4 months, starved the city, and murdered his sister's son. Finally, Octavia surrendered and was exiled, but not before Octavian was haunted by the ghost of the young boy he had just killed. Okay, we need to talk about how terrible this documentary's graphics are. Anyway, with his rivals defeated and Rome in chaos, Octavian stepped in and offered to restore order. And in return, the grateful Senate gave him the title of Augustus and made him the first emperor of Rome. But don't worry. He never took the title king because that would have made him look like a barbarian. Augustus's reign lasted for 45 years, and during that time he did some pretty amazing things. First off, he reorganized the military, standardized coinage, established a professional police force, and built public works projects to employ the poor. But his greatest accomplishment was creating a period of peace that would last for over 200 years. During Augustus's rule, Rome enjoyed an unprecedented amount of peace and prosperity. The empire reached its greatest territorial extent, and the arts, literature, and architecture flourished. But not everyone was happy with the new regime. As Rome grew richer, it became a target for outside invaders. In 39 BC, The Germanic tribes crossed the Rhine River and settled in Roman territory. And in 32 BC, the Kingdom of Pontus launched a full-scale invasion of Asia Minor. Luckily, Rome was able to beat back both of these invasions. But in 225 BC, the Germanic tribes struck back with a vengeance. Under the leadership of Arminius, a Romanized German general, they crushed 3 Roman legions at the Battle of Teutoburg Forest. Not only was this a humiliating defeat for Rome, but it also marked the end of their expansion into Germania. In fact, the next 2 centuries would be defined by the struggle to hold on to what Rome already had. While Augustus was able to put down most of the rebellions in his empire, there were still a few hotspots. In Judea, for example, the client kingdom of Herod the Great was able to keep the Jewish revolt against Roman rule under control. But after he died in 4 BC, the Jews revolted and were quickly crushed. During the 1st century AD, Rome saw a lot of upheaval. Emperor Tiberius was a paranoid schizophrenic who executed thousands of people without charging them with a crime. Caligula was a drug-addled teenager who prostituted himself in taverns and brothels. Claudius was a stuttering, wheelchair-bound invalid who was probably poisoned by his wife. And Nero was a megalomaniacal poet who infamously fiddled while Rome burned. To make matters worse, a series of natural disasters and economic crises plagued the empire during this period, which led to widespread poverty, famine, and disease. In 66 AD, the Jewish revolt against Roman rule flared up again, and it would become the largest and most violent rebellion in Roman history. The Jews were led by a man known as the false Messiah, who was eventually captured and crucified. But the Romans didn't crush the rebellion until after destroying Jerusalem and its first temple. And while Rome was able to put down most of the rebellions in its empire, there was one group of people who proved to be very difficult to subdue: the Jews. Rome had conquered Judea in 63 BC, but the Jews were never happy with their Roman overlords. In 66 AD, the Jews revolted again, this time led by a man called Simon Bar Kokhba. The Romans were able to put down the rebellion, but not before destroying the Second Temple in Jerusalem. By the 2nd century AD, the Pax Romana was in full swing, and the Roman Empire was enjoying a golden age of peace and prosperity. The economy was stable, trade was booming, and the arts and literature were flourishing. However, this prosperity did little to alleviate the massive gap between rich and poor. And as the empire grew, the provinces became increasingly alienated from the Roman center. In 129 AD, the province of Judea revolted again, this time led by a man called Shimon Bar Kokhba. The Romans were able to put down the rebellion, but not before destroying the city of Jerusalem and its Second Temple. This would be the last Jewish revolt against Rome for several hundred years. But not everyone was happy with the New World Order. In the east, the Parthian Empire was growing stronger, and in the west, the Germanic tribes were becoming more aggressive. In 161 AD, the Marcomanni and the Quadi invaded Roman territory and sacked the city of Carnuntum. Although the Romans were able to push the barbarians back across the Danube, this conflict would drain the Roman treasury and weaken the empire. Marcus Aurelius died in 180 AD, and his successor, Commodus, was a weak and ineffective ruler. The empire was plunged into crisis, and civil war seemed imminent. But Commodus was assassinated in 192 AD, and the crisis was averted. In the early 3rd century, Rome faced a series of crises that threatened to tear the empire apart. In 193 AD, Septimius Severus came to power, and he would do everything in his power to hold the empire together. He raised taxes, recruited auxiliary troops, and launched a series of military campaigns to secure the borders. But it was his successors who would finish the job. Caracalla was assassinated in 217 AD, and his younger brother, Geta, succeeded him. But Geta was unpopular with the Praetorian Guard, and they forced him to share power with his older brother, Caracalla. The brothers fought each other constantly, and eventually Geta was killed. Julia Maesa then came to power, and she would be the first woman to rule the Roman Empire. But Rome's troubles were far from over. In 235 AD, the emperor was assassinated and civil war broke out. Several pretenders to the throne seized power and the empire descended into chaos. But in 260 AD, Aurelian emerged victorious and restored order to Rome. However, Rome's problems didn't end there. In the 3rd century, Rome was hit by a series of plagues that killed millions of people. This, combined with a failing economy, led to widespread poverty, famine, and unrest. In 284 AD, Diocletian divided the empire into 2 halves in an attempt to make it more manageable, but this only led to more instability and civil war. In 306 AD, Constantius Chlorus seized power in the Western Roman Empire, and his son, Constantine the Great, became the first Roman emperor to convert to Christianity. In 313 AD, the Edict of Milan granted religious tolerance to Christians throughout the Roman Empire, and Christianity began to spread rapidly. In 324 AD, Constantine defeated his rival Licinius and reunited the Roman Empire. But he also moved the capital from Rome to Constantinople in the east. In 378 AD, the Visigoths defeated the Romans at the Battle of Adrianople, and this victory marked the beginning of the end for Rome. Rome would continue to decline throughout the 4th and 5th centuries and eventually fell to the Germanic tribes in 476 AD. But the legacy of Rome would live on in the Middle Ages, and if you want to learn more about that, stay tuned for more information.